Member Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Let me welcome our distinguished panelists and to all of our guests who have taken the time to come here today for this important hearing. The consideration of treaties is among the most important responsibilities of this committee, and I wish we could do it more often. I'd like to welcome in particular one guest we have in the audience from the great state of New Jersey, Joe Ruffalo, Jr. He is a veteran who has served our country in Vietnam, earned a Bronze Star. He's been a businessman and a community leader in the Lions Club, the Knights of Columbus, the Boy Scouts of America. Though retinitis pigmentosa has claimed his vision, Joe has done critical work to assure the full integration of people with disabilities into our society. He served as president of the Special Education Parent and Professional Organization for 13 years, past chairman of the Board of Trustees of the New Jersey Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and he currently serves as president of the New Jersey Federation for the Blind, a position he has held since 1993. So, Joe, thank you very much for being here, for your advocacy. I also have been joined by another New Jerseyan, Linda Menendez. That's L, not an N, so we could be cousins, maybe. We're one N apart, but who has joined you, and I welcome her here today as well. I have long been a proud champion of the disabilities community because I believe that everyone should have the opportunity to achieve their dreams and fulfill their God-given potential. The pursuit of accessibility and reasonable accommodation for all embodies the greatest and best of American ideals, the principles of equality and the protection of minorities, as well as the unalienable right to pursue happiness. I was a strong supporter on the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which promoted the fairness and equality that people with disabilities enjoy here to countries around the world. As chairman of this committee at the time, I held 2 hearings in the late 2013 to consider the convention and was proud to support the successful passage of the convention from the committee in 2014. I was disappointed that the full Senate did not take up the convention, but we've continued to work to advance the rights of those in the disabilities community. Today we consider a narrow but still critically important treaty intended to break down barriers that have prevented those with disabilities from accessing and learning from books and published materials. Book famine, or lack of access to accessible texts, disproportionately impacts those with reading and visual disabilities. The National Federation for the Blind estimates that only 5% of published books can be found in an accessible format in the developed world. That percentage is even smaller in the world's poorest countries. Modern technology can be used to convert books into accessible format, Braille, digital Braille, or navigable audiobook. But restrictive national copyright laws have hampered these efforts, and even once produced, incompatible national copyright laws make it difficult for countries to share their formatted works. In 2013, representatives of 51 countries met in Marrakesh to address this issue, and all eventually signed on to the treaty, whose primary objective is to ensure that persons with visual impairments are able to exercise their right to freedom of expression, education, and the opportunity to conduct research. The treaty requires signatories to create an exception in domestic copyright law that would allow authorized entities to create published works in a format accessible to visually impaired persons, allow for the impact and export of these works, so long as national law allows and the recipients are the intended beneficiaries, and ensures that all exceptions and limitations to copyright laws do not prejudice the legitimate interests of the work's right holders. The United States signed the treaty on October 3rd of 2013. It entered into force in 2016, and it is about time that we ratify the treaty. Let me just close by giving one example. This treaty would bring concrete benefits to visually impaired Americans like Veronica Gaspa, a young constituent of mine from South Orange, New Jersey. She is the president of the New Jersey Association of Blind Students and a junior at Seton Hall University who is studying English and journalism. When Veronica was in high school, she took Spanish, but couldn't get the Spanish materials she needed to follow up with her fellow students. And by the time an accessible copy was made, the school year would be over. Veronica was always interested in other cultures, but she and many other visually impaired students she networks with stay away from language classes in college out of fear they won't be able to keep up or get materials that would help them learn. She is friends with blind people around the world, but cannot recommend books to them because there likely is not an accessible copy in their country. Ratifying this treaty would have a direct impact on the lives of Veronica and her friends. For over 3 years, my staff has worked with the staff of Senator Corker as well as the staff of the Judiciary Committee, in a bipartisan fashion to advance this treaty and its implementing legislation, which I understand has the strong support of each of the stakeholder groups represented here today, the visually impaired community, libraries, and the Publishers Association. Proud to serve as an original co-sponsor of the implementing legislation, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists and hopefully, Mr. Chairman, adopting the treaty, helping you pass it, and hopefully getting passage on the floor. Mr. Chairman, thank you all for your testimony, and it's nice when we get a harmonious panel here. It's not always the case. So, as I understand it from your testimony, all three of you have been working on the Marrakesh Treaty and the implementing legislation since its inception, and I understand that you were in Marrakesh when the treaty was negotiated as well. So, I think you've shared some of these, but what insights can you share from the negotiation process? And what do you see as the concrete benefits? Obviously, the most significant one being that individuals who are reading impaired can, because of their vision, will have now access to a world of books that they didn't have. But are there others as well?
Scott?
Well, indeed, there are many benefits to this treaty, and we've touched on many of them. I would argue that nearly 500,000 books will become available to Americans in accessible formats when we ratify this treaty and when the EU comes on board. That is one of the benefits. Another is sending a message throughout the world that the right to access information is truly a human right. And I guess one of the insights that I learned is that when people come together and work hard and share the same end goal, you can get across the finish line. You say today that we're a harmonious panel. We haven't always been harmonious, let me assure you. When we went to Marrakesh in 2013, 37 issues remained unresolved in the treaty text. To give you some perspective on that, the Beijing Treaty for performers of audio-visual works started its diplomatic conference in 2012 with only 2 issues left to be sorted out. It took a tremendous amount of work and compromise in Marrakesh to get the deal done. In fact, the King of Morocco sent a message to the diplomatic conference that if we could not come to a consensus, he would close the airports. So that incentivized us, and we got the deal done.
Okay. Well, that's good.
For those of you who are here today, this is not the norm in our state.
You've given me, Mr. LaBarre, some ideas of how we might get things done in Washington. Just very quickly, I gathered this from your testimony, but I just for the record want to make sure it's pinpoint accurate. Mr. Adler and Mr. Ben, have all the aspects of the implementing legislation been resolved to the satisfaction of the stakeholders in the publishing and library industries?
Yes, Senator. As I said, we had the difficulty of working not only with many different nations that have different legal systems and cultural perspectives, but remember we were working with developed countries, less developed countries, and the least developed countries who need this treaty perhaps more than anyone else does. And given that broad spectrum of interest, the ability to accommodate the diversity through a process that would ensure some predictability and accountability for the manner in which works would be exchanged across borders, no longer just within the United States, as was the case under the Chafee Amendment during the first 20 years of its existence, but now pursuant to an international agreement that means all of these member states that become contracting parties will now be able to reproduce and distribute copies of works and exchange them across borders with other countries. So the idea of predictability and accountability was important. Mm-hmm. As you might imagine, in an international group of member states, there are different ideas about what constitutes predictability and accountability. The last issue for us was the need to address the inclusion in a revised Chafee Amendment of the provisions of the treaty that address the practices of authorized entities, because it is going to be those government agencies and nonprofit organizations in each of the contracting parties who will be engaged in the cross-border exchange of copyrighted works. And we wanted to make sure that they followed their practices. The practices that were agreed upon in the treaty are relatively modest. What an authorized entity is supposed to do is establish and follow its own practices to establish that persons it serves are beneficiary persons, eligible under the treaty to be able to receive these types of accessible format copies, limit to beneficiary persons and authorized entities distribution and making available of accessible format copies, discourage the reproduction, distribution, and making available of unauthorized copies, and finally, to maintain due care in and records of its handling of copies of works while respecting the privacy of beneficiary persons in accordance with the treaty. We wanted to make sure that U.S. law implementing the treaty reflected those aspects of the treaty, because those aspects of the treaty had not been part of the original provision in the U.S. Copyright Act. And that's why we think that the legislation that the chairman and ranking member have co-sponsored with the bipartisan leadership of the Senate Judiciary Committee takes care of that problem.
Well, I'll close in just saying the unanimity here is important to the successful passage in the Senate, which requires a supermajority vote for a treaty. I thank all of you for the work, the hard work that has made this moment possible. And Mr. Labar, I just would say that you're an extraordinary example of when we give individuals the tools of the incredible capacity and ability they have to succeed. And I salute you and thank you all for your testimony.